recording on. Let's close down Mr. Kataria, who is a great benefactor of humanity, in my opinion. And let's retake the conversation we had started last week. We titled that They Live Part 2 because it simply was too much to say and too little time when we met last week. And we have been through quite interesting experiences as part of a cult. So we thought we would want to share something more. Last time we talked about how cults tend to appear magically in our lives, and there is a sort of a network in front of us that tends to capture our innate longing for spirituality. Spirituality tends to express itself in so many ways. Last week, Eduardo sent us a link, or say a suggestion, to watch a video from a series called Breaking Bad, and it showed a couple of people in Mexico, members of a drug cartel, who were dragging themselves on the ground to reach a small temple of the so-called Sagrada Muerte, which is like the sacred death, a sort of deity which people from the organized crime consider as their god, to which they ask favors, to which they pay homage, they do worship. So even people who we would consider very, very removed from any spirituality, they seem to feel that there is something on the other side which is worth considering and that can help us and somehow get us through a difficult situation. This is in its, let's say, naivety, because when you have a deal with a creature that is, say, a god of a, say, low level, or just to say it straight, if you have a deal with the devil, so to speak, you obviously get into a sort of contract. And that has a high cost, which may be beyond what you know and understand. So seeing people who adore the sacred death, as they do in some certain parts of Latin America, may seem pretty sad. But there is a good side to that, which we should also consider. That is, everybody, no matter what his level in society and in, let's say, consciousness, seems to feel a need to relate to whatever is on the other side, in the subtle world, we could say, the world where we go when we die, the world where we go when we sleep. And that is somehow reconforting, because it reminds us that when the level of our being changes, then we may also point towards a higher level of spirituality, which will evolve from the original one. So last time, as I said, we were looking at how easy it is to be taken into a big religion or a small cult, and how it's easy to get out of one and be immediately courted by another. It seems that these are like magnets which are there in order to capture our longing for spirituality and get us in a sort of loop where we don't do much damage to whoever is controlling the planet. I call this a loop because there is a tendency to repetition and to go in circles when you are part of these organizations. And you will find yourself in rituals which always go on the same path. You will find yourself repeating things and being told things over and over again in repetitions. All of these tend to use our longing for the truth as a trap, because they get a bit of truth and then cover it with all their doctrine. Then they hang it in front of us. And our souls tend to recognize the truth and go for it because they are still naive and young and unprepared. So we tend to bite the whole thing and get caught. This time, we would like to consider a couple of ways that these cults use to keep us enslaved. And this is common not only to cults, but you will recognize that this is a common method for most mainstream religions and several, let's say, organizations which may not be recognized as religious. So first of all, you may have heard about the Pavlov's dog, how certain reactions can be induced by the repetition of certain stimulus. So after a while, Mr. Pavlov rang the bell and the dog would get saliva in his mouth because he knew that normally the food was coming when the bell rang. And similarly, we may be programmed in a very crude way by the repetition of certain stimulus and response. In which directions are cults programming people using this sort of low-level programming? One, for example, is to induce fear. So we have witnessed several sessions in our, say, movement, where fear was used to crush people's self-confidence. So because people had said or done something which really was very innocent and without any malice, they would be scolded and reproached very heavily for a very long time. Images of the abyss, images of eternal punishments would be shown to them for any minor little thing. Horrible karma would be mentioned, magnified by the fact that whatever was the error or supposed error had been committed towards a great master. So if you had forgotten to add a certain courtesy word in an email message, something absolutely irrelevant, but then you would be told, oh, there is a hidden conspiracy in your mind to try and do this and that, to take down the master, to take his place. And people would believe that because it came from the supposed master, and they would seriously start despising themselves, and their self-confidence would go down, and they felt a big longing for forgiveness. So they would do anything to hear the master say, everything is forgiven, my friends, now you can go home in peace. But that was after a long session that would crush their self-confidence, make them feel dependent, and make them feel that they were in need of somebody else to tell them that they are right. So in other words, you give away your power to someone who then uses that power, and you feel you are inferior or you are dependent because you have been induced to do so. One way to make all of this process more effective was the sleep deprivation, because there was such an amount of activities and of practices and rituals during the day and part of the night that people were normally unable to lead a normal life, which includes, say, 7 or 8 hours of sleep. several of our friends would sleep like 2 hours per night. There was a period when we also did sleep very little. That affects your health, but before it does so, it affects your ability to think clearly and to question things that you're told. So it is like a vicious circle, because friends of ours who had been doing everything for their master, almost forgetting about their own life, basically living somebody else's life to be always there when there was a meeting, to be always working to improve his house and things like that, then could not even go home at night to rest because there were other things to be done. And then there were exercises that they should have done in that little time between, say, 2 a.m. and 7 a.m. when they were supposed to be back for another long day of activities in the temple that was the master's house. To make things even more pleasant, that happened in a place where there was an average of 35 to 40 degrees and mosquitoes biting you all over the place. So all of this made people suffer considerably. And some of them seemed to consider this suffering and this feel of uneasiness as a very well-deserved trial, or even a karma they were paying for. So there is no limit to what a person that has been programmed can take in order to try and gain the acceptance and the forgiveness of, say, God through the person of his guru. Another important aspect of what a cult can do through programming is to cut everything that connects you to your future and to your friends and family. How do you cut somebody from his future? Well, simply enough, you constantly repeat that the end is coming and is very near. So suppose that you are convinced that in a year or two, the world is coming to an end. Would you still consider important several of the things you do today? Of course, things would change in your priority list. So we heard of people that were part of this movement who had taken back their children from school because they said, everything is ending in a year or so. Why should we consider it important for them to graduate? There's even people who stopped going to the dentist because they said, who cares? In a year, everything is over. Well, you can recognize those people because their sons don't have a degree and their teeth are pretty bad. But seriously, people were believing this to a degree that there were big groups sometimes retreating into the mountains because some date was coming when the end had been predicted. That was not particularly in our cult, but other, let's say, sister and brother cults of the same root had this habit of predicting the end with a date and time, which was very humiliating, of course. But people would believe that, and they would sort of sacrifice their future on the altar of their master. So you are told, don't make plans for the long term. You don't need them. The end is always near. I remember that in that particular movement that was called the agnostic movement, they always told you about the Third World War and some planet that was going to hit the Earth, and volcanoes exploding and other things. Since the 60s, in the last century, all the way to the present, there's always some impending disaster. And the effect is you are cut off from your own plans and the future. And of course, it's easier for your guru to get all of your energy and attention because basically he remains as your only direction for salvation. Another thing that happens often in these contexts is you are told, we are your real family. Those who are part of your official family are just a matter of karma, so don't you consider them very important. So this is also a way to tie connections, sorry, to cut the ties around the faithful, in order that she loses a connection, and at that point she is easier to maneuver and deceive. This normally leads the faithful into a pattern which is that of salvation, in which you are basically powerless and unworthy. But if you do all that you're told, there is a chance that by grace you will be saved. So people's self-confidence and self-esteem take a further hit and go underground, and they cling to the only thing which may bring them to salvation, which is the local guru and his set of rituals and practices. That's all they have. So they cling to it with all their forces and then give to it all that they can. The masters who lead these cults, curiously enough, they are also deceived very heavily. And you can tell that when you hear what they tell you about their experiences in the subtle worlds. I'm referring to astral travel, which, by the way, could be a good topic for a future meeting. We have heard and read about these masters telling us, oh, the end is coming. They've shown me. I've seen the planet in ruin, everything in flames, people going around like zombies, radiations and everything. And these gurus never took the time to question whether these images and scenarios were actually just a figment of imagination or a projection, or were actually connected to the truth. In fact, we have seen now in retrospective that they were not true, but the effect on the students or faithful of these images and scenarios coming from the subtle world were devastating, because people would believe their master, the master would believe his contact in the astral world. So there was a chain of deception going from the question mark there in the subtle world to the local guru that was considered to be a person with very high consciousness and powers, but the guru was deceived himself. And then he, believing in what he had seen or being shown, had been shown, then he in turn would deceive the students. So when somebody believes what he's saying, it's a lot more credible. We know this by experience, that if I knew that I am lying, I would be a lot less convincing than if I believe that I'm telling the truth. So gurus are often maneuvered and deceived by this mechanism, because they themselves consider to have the gift of seeing the subtle worlds in all their reality. In fact, this is not the case, as we have seen.
Tante persone che con l'immaginazione ti fa spingere a vedere certi futuri disastrosi, può darsi che si crea una certa realtà.
Mm-hmm. By the way, if a guru can convince enough people that, for example, an asteroid is hitting Earth next year, and the humanity will perish, and enough people make this scenario their own, and they start thinking about it. Imagination is a sort of creation tool. So to some degree, based on how many they are and how often they think about this, they will create, if not the asteroid itself, at least the psychological consequences of the asteroid in their own life. So misery, poverty, a lack of social contacts, etc., etc. We are often used as projectors to create a certain reality, because in large amounts, people can skew the timeline in which they live in a certain direction. So if I can make 1 million people think about misery and pandemics or anything dark, these people are actively contributing to the creation of a certain mood in their area and inside themselves, first of all. So the ability of people that have a certain power to induce a certain thinking inside of us doesn't only affect us, but uses us to affect others. So we are used as unconscious creators, so to speak, because we are programmed to think about certain things unconsciously. And then these things become like patterns or cycles inside of our brain. They induce some feelings, which in turn radiate into reality. So this is a sort of a chain of creation. It comes from an unknown source through a guru, through the faithful, but unconscious, and then out to the virtual world that we call physical reality. All of this means that those who control a high number of people, say through the mass media, they can actually indirectly curve the timeline towards a certain direction by using thousands or millions of people's creative power in the direction they choose. So this is why it is so important to be independent thinkers and to not take at face value what we are given by the mass media. One of the very typical tools which are used to deceive people in cults is channeling. You probably know what channeling looks or feels like because you may have seen somebody on the internet. And you may have seen that there is a wide range of quality in the type of channeling you may get, from the ridiculous to the very, very sublime. And some people are really happy with a very low level type of channeling. Somebody says, oh, I'm now receiving a message from an angel, and he's saying this and that, you will be fine, everything will be good, and then people applaud, and everybody is happy. Of course, there are several drawbacks to this, because you hardly have a channeler verifying the identity of the source. And then there is the possibility, which is normally the case, that the source doesn't give any precise message at all, but just reconforting messages, basically telling people what they want to hear, which by itself is not a disaster. The problem is when these messages push you towards a passive attitude, like be quiet, just wait, we are coming to help humanity. So you just keep the faith, and we from Alpha Centauri, the Pleiades, or whatever planetary system or dimension, we are coming. Somebody made a label for this and called it the stand down technique. That means pushing people to release their idea of engaging and going back into a passive stance where they say, well, everything will be fine. So I will just basically wait for somebody else to do the job. Of course, not much can happen if you don't engage personally. And you shouldn't expect all of this to come from an outside savior. I see an interesting message here. I think everybody knows, but let's just repeat because it's good news. Of the protests in Berlin, and I've read that something is also happening in London, and in Spain there's a group of people called Doctors for the Truth,
Madrid.
Which has been inspired by a similar group in Germany. So there are signs of awakening, which are a beautiful thing to see. In general, we may expect that not everybody is so easy to deceive, and there will be a small percentage of people who think for themselves. Their presence, and their presence in the sense of their being around us, is a powerful stimulus for us to follow in that direction of being independent thinkers. Of course, their presence also must be in a psychological sense, that you cannot just protest because you like going against. Protesting needs to have some sort of positive goal. Otherwise, it's just an ego that wants to shout and create a mess. By now, I think you know these mechanisms exist, and they can make your life a lot more complicated. If we fall in the clutches of some ideology, religion, or cult, we are probably going to be there for at least the time that was, let's say, necessary according to our spirit. If the spirit has helped us to be caught, that means we had to learn something. That's the optimistic point of view. You may also spend your whole life there. Now, what that means depends on the point of view that you take. So if you consider yourself like an immortal spirit that incarnates in different physical situations, then of course that life may be very useful for a learning curve. We may not be conscious at a certain point, but we all have the right and the possibility to become conscious. So we cannot really judge others based on what they do or do not do. If we get out of a cult and many other friends of ours do not, they may be on their own path in a different position, and they need, say, a bigger dose of what is given there. So let's have an eye of understanding towards those who somehow choose to stay in that condition and not come out. It is very counterproductive for us to go and shake them and say, hey, wake up, you can't stay there, can't you see this and that? If they're not ripe, if they're not ready, they will find all sorts of answers to let you know that they will stay there. And you should live with this. The reason why you went in and then came out, that will make your life a bit more complicated, because you have undergone changes that you normally wouldn't want to have in your life, like going to a different continent and then coming back, then losing all your friends, things like that. But yet, in our experience, what you gain is in proportion to what your investment has been in terms of emotions and efforts and changes. So I personally consider that our experience has been very fruitful, and I do not like to compare these to other people's experiences because it's so difficult to put yourself in other people's shoes, and it's not really an effort worth doing. It's a lot more useful to look inside and catch what's happening rather than looking at others. All right, so I believe this is most of what I was willing to share. Perhaps we can now stop the recording